Well, hello. Thank you for joining and watching this particular In Conversation, another of our Farnham Society conversations with what I've always called some of our Farnham personalities, but also Farnham organisations. And I would say today that our conversation certainly covers both of those things, a Farnham personality and representing an organisation, both well known to us here in Farnham. So my conversation today is with Michael Blower. And as I said, well known, I'm sure, to many. Indeed, Michael has had more than 50 years, and he will tell us, I'm sure, contribution in various ways to Farnham societies and the Farnham community more generally. And Michael, you won't mind me starting by saying, indeed, appointed MBE in 2020, and I quote, for services to the community in Farnham. So I can think of no better person to have a conversation about Farnham than your good self. So good morning. How are you?
Morning, and thank you very much for that very nice introduction.
Well, there are so many ways I could have introduced you, actually, and I'm looking at my notes here. I could have said you're current vice president of the Farnham Society, but a previous chairman of the Farnham Society, I think president of the Farnham Buildings Preservation Trust. You've been a past councillor, a past Waverley mayor. You even had a weekly newspaper column called, I think, Environmental Viewpoint. And I suppose you're very well known for being a champion for conservation and preservation. If I might wrap it up as the preservation of heritage in our rather lovely market town. So that's a bit of a longer introduction, Michael. And because you're well known, I thought I might start with perhaps some of the things that perhaps aren't so well known about you. And I'd like to start with the Blower Foundation, which I wasn't aware of, which I think you started and set up in 2004. So could you tell us a little bit about the Blower Foundation? What was the purpose behind it and how is it today?
Well, thank you. Yes, it was set up by Damien. I more or less, I had a bit of illness in 2000, and Damien really took over the practice, and I never really resurfaced, if you like, as a practitioner. So he took over, and what was going on and had gone on during my period was people would ring us up, generally through estate agents, Hamptons and people like that, and say, we're buying X place and we'd like to get some idea of it. We want to extend it, we want to do this. But, and so we found ourselves doing quite a bit of work. We weren't, if you like, commissioned because it was still they hadn't bought it. And Damien then said, well, when they said, well, look, you've been very helpful over this, and we are going to go ahead, but what do we owe you? And Damien instituted this sort of foundation, and they would send off, some remuneration to the foundation, and that is what really was the idea behind it. And then we got involved with exhibitions, and I think we did about 8 exhibitions with the Farnham Society, a heritage weekend at the Maltings, and that was, if you like, the Blower Foundation. We did buildings of merit. One year, another year we did reusing old buildings, passages and yards, that sort of thing. And those were, sort of, in other words, the foundation wasn't just collecting money. We did give it to students as sort of bursaries who were studying here. We had a very good New Zealand student here and gave him some money to get going, and in his studies. So it was a good effort, good.
And you're continuing to develop it, or Damien?
Damien is, but I don't actually get involved in it. I'm not one of his trustees. He has one sadly lost 2 years ago. But yes, no, he is continuing it, because he still gets asked to do a lot of what you might call pro bono work.
Oh, I know about pro bono work, Michael. But what interested me when I looked at it was that it also hosts and holds an archive of your work in terms of, your review of notable properties and premises in and around Farnham, for which you are also well known. But what really struck me was more than 200 sketchbooks that you've filled over the years. It also holds those as an archive.
Yes, I'd actually forgotten about that. But with the Stedman's, the practice goes back, you probably know, to about 1895, and we've got most of the schemes and that Stedman worked on right from when practice was started, and these are an archive which is there. We've got drawings of Stedman's in that period, and lots of buildings around, and that's sort of and on that, I suppose, we've added to it as well. We used to reckon that we did about 50 commissions a year, but I believe some came to nothing. Some were very involved and probably went on for 2 or 3 years. So we seemed to get, when I started in practice here, it was about 3,000. We were on about 3,000, and I think then now Damien's reached about 8,000.
Goodness.
It speeded up, but so somewhere up in a containers up on our property, we've got 8,000 piles of drawings and of Farnham and all round about. So yes.
Which is amazing. You make that available for research, or when people are looking into the history of Farnham.
Yes. So, they do. They ring up. Have you got anything on something? And if we worked on it, obviously we do. We can pretty well trace it. But as I have to admit, with no great pride, I'm not really computer. I have to go up there and do the work hands-on. And but Damien now scans everything, and I don't think he knows what a piece of paper is.
Well, look, I'm sure in this
life the hype goes on.
Yes, look, you're entitled not to be as technically adept as my 13-year-old granddaughter, because I'm nowhere near as adept as she is either. But look, I think we'll dip in and out of that story represented by the Archive and the Blower Foundation. But perhaps another thing not well known about you, and let's go right back to the beginning briefly, was you were born in Brussels. Now, that was a surprise to me. Born in Brussels in the 1930s, and your first years were growing up in Brussels.
Yes, well, I was actually born in a little village called Waterloo. You might have heard of it.
Oh.
I was about 10 miles from Brussels. And of course, people always say, what platform? And I say, well, I was in the arrivals department. But it was...
for a moment, I thought you were referring to that Waterloo. But no, the place Waterloo Station was named after.
Yeah, yes, of course. And but my father was... sort of First World War victim, and he really was a victim because he was at Gallipoli and then ended up in France. And after the First War was finished, he was in sort of convalescence in Flanders, and people of the chateau where these officers were billeted said, well, Captain Blair, why don't you take your troop and go to Brussels because they're desperate for horses. They've either eaten them or had them all blown up. And they want to restart the racing, Belgian racing. Now, he did do that. He took his troop. All the boys became, stable lads. Jockeys were all British. Owners were mainly Belgium, and so that's how we were in Belgium. And my mother was had been got there because her mother was living off an American trust, and apparently after the First War it was very important that the exchange in Belgium was so favourable to American the dollar that she was advised to go and live in Belgium. And that's how she and my father found themselves, together. And that's where I was born, and I did school right up to age 11. And in 1940, the consul was advising all British to get home. And my father refused first, saying, we beat them once, we'll beat them again. But my mother was far more prudent and said, look, I'm going, you can stay if you want to, but I'm not going to stay here with 3 children. And thank goodness she did. And he followed, I think. He saw the wisdom in the end. But we were pretty hard up, I must say, at the beginning of the war, and had a fairly tough time. But by luck, we found ourselves family in London, and then with bombing and everything else, we decided, or they decided that they knew somebody down here in Liphook, which was where we went. Right. Lovely little village. It was a sort of centre of that area, and that's where we ended up. And of course, I was at school in this area, and got to know Farnham in the early 40s.
Well, your first introduction to Farnham, but I think you went to school up in Berkshire. But let's move on a little bit, because you actually had developed an interest in architecture and in art, and we'll come to that in a moment. And you went to the Portsmouth College of Art, I think, to study architecture.
Well, I did, most certainly, and a very, very good school of architecture it was. Not overpowering. I'd had a pretty bad start with a fierce architect in London when I left school. I was articled to them, and they were big people, but not very pleasant boss. And I really was very sort of, I went to night school 3 nights a week, day release, and went to the Hammersmith School of Architecture, which was, picked up. But I remember one person saying in the office, Michael, he said, you will never be qualified if you don't get to a school. And all schools in London at that time, there were about 5 schools of architecture, were absolutely packed with servicemen coming out, and you just couldn't get in. And Portsmouth was sort of, gosh, yes, okay, we've got to start on Monday.
Well, what interests me, and I'll dip back into what I was reading about the Blower Foundation and what I know from our current discussions, is this the dominance of your drawings and sketchbooks and what I might call, in my simple way, art. And I was interested to ask you, were you interested in art or were you interested in architecture? Did you want to be an artist, or was the practical choice to be an architect?
Well, simply that. I mean, I was going to be an architect.
You never thought about being a sketch, somebody's sketch or art? That was a hobby.
I'm a sketcher, and I'm not an artist. I mean, it would be a bit of an insult to what I call the great artists of this world to call myself an artist, but I do adore drawing, or have done. I find it less this now, but I do really, you know, I always had a sketchbook, and I think it was a bit unusual actually for architects to, you know, some could draw, but some never bothered.
And is it a useful attribute in terms of an architect? I mean, speaking as somebody that knows nothing about this, you know, the ability to conceive and create and have on page the idea comes from being good at sketching, does it?
I think so. I think one does get a feel for space, but I wouldn't say that it makes me a better architect than somebody who can't draw. You know,
Right.
I don't really, but it's just something I've always, well, not always, because I never went to art school or anything like that. It just seemed to be there, and I developed it. And so there we are. Yeah, I'm an architect, I think.
So initially, as a young architect, you had something of an international flavour to your activity. And let's go back to Brussels, because another notable thing is the fact that as a young architect, you helped, or you were on the project of the British Pavilion at the Brussels World Expo, quite a big event of its day in 1958. How did you get involved in that?
Well, I think I'm usually sort of, I reckon I'm fairly lucky. But when I came out of my national service, I went to the Architectural Association, who had a sort of employment sort of element there, and said, you know, any jobs? And I remember the man very well, the sort of chief there, said, Blower, he said, you speak French, don't you? And I said, yes. And he said, look, the architects, Howard Lobb, who was one of the directors on the Festival of Britain, and been appointed to do the British pavilions, is looking for an assistant. So I trundled across Bedford Square, up a bit of Gower Street, and knocked on the door. And 15 minutes later, I came out with a job as site architect in Brussels. And now when they asked me, did I speak French? I said, yes. Of course, they didn't speak a word of French when they interviewed me, so they had to take my word for it. But I did. I think the job was, I was lucky in this sense, is that I had, prior to national service, I'd worked on a factory site, building site, as an assistant to the foreman. And so I had about 9 months practice of, you know, site work. And of course, that's what Lobb was looking for, was somebody who could deal with a site operation in Brussels, you know. So that's how I got the job. And the terrific, wonderful people to work for, really very fine man who encouraged me a lot.
It sounds very military, Michael. You know, Blower, you speak French, you go to Brussels. So, but a great experience, and it must have, you know, set you up for, you know, the start of that really significant architectural career. But what brought you to Farnham? You could have gone to Shrewsbury, couldn't you, as centre of the Blower family? But yes, what brought you to Farnham?
Well, I nearly went to Oxford, but yeah, good. Don't forget, I'd seen the magic of Castle Street from a bus, an Aldershot district bus, during my school days. So I did know Farnham, and but however, I think the important thing is that when I worked in Guildford. We went to America for a short while and worked there, and decided America wasn't for us. Came back, got a job in Guildford, and I was very much involved with the architects, Southeast Architects, part of the RIB, and they had architects panels advising councils on aesthetics, because at that time, the Planning Act had only just gone, 10 years, 15 years. There were a great shortage of of planners. And, you know, they were appointing planners, sort of, you know, and people almost drained theirs and told them to put a tie on, you know, and they became planning officers. And that is not an exaggeration. And they had no idea at all about aesthetics. So I was on a panel of architects, always 3 architects from another town, of Camberley and Guildford High Street, Addleston, Chertsey, several of them. We would meet monthly, look at all the planning applications, and the clerk of the council would attend, and we said what we thought about whether it was a good design or bad design. He that took notes, took them to the council at their meeting. We never attended, never got involved again, but we gave an opinion about. Now, the only council, the only town that didn't have an architects panel was Farnham.
Ah.
Now, that
even with its architectural heritage, you know, Harold Faulkner.
I know. You see, Farnham had a proud. Has stood about a bit above others, but Godalming had one, and Guildford, of course, had 2, one for the High Street and one for the town. However, I met Stedman, going back to your question, I met Stedman, architect from Farnham, at one of these panels. He was chairing it, and we got on very well. He was a much older man than I was. And he offered me, he said, well, look, I need a partner, Michael, are you interested? And I said, yes, well, quite honestly, I said, I've been 5 years now here at Scott Brownrigg of Brightwell fame. And I said, you know, I'm quite happy to look at something new. And so we managed to come together and make a partnership agreement. And I was quite relieved, really, to come to Farnham, because, believe it or not, when I did visit it, there wasn't Farnham was completely untouched, if you like, by the developers. And but alas, by the few weeks after I got here, of course, I could hear the bulldozers pulling down the half of our East Street. In other words, the Woolmead was looming.
Oh dear. Well, we'll get into development. I'm conscious of keeping us moving. I always knew that a conversation with you, Michael, would probably require a series in its own right. But I'm interested to move on to your, and perhaps you've just referred to it actually, this interest that's a dominant feature of your career, conservation. You mentioned aesthetics. Was it around this time that started to develop?
Oh, no, I think deep down, as a war baby, we've always had nothing, if you like, both as a family, and I think the country lost so much. But I hated the idea of pulling anything down when it could be reused. And that's why we made that exhibition at the Maltings. We've reused some wonderful things in Farnham, but we've also pulled down some very good things, and that is a fact. So I've never ever found it difficult to be part. And looking back, I can tell you that while we were in America, I joined a group which was trying to save an American semi-skyscraper because it was out of date, but in fact it was a most wonderful building. We lost, but so I have thought to myself, well, why did you get involved in that one? In Brussels, they pulled down that great Victor Horta building in the centre of Brussels, the Maison des Peuples, which is one of the classic Art Nouveau sort of period buildings, but that disappeared. In Farnham, in Guildford, I tried to save a wonderful Georgian building in the High Street, lost that, and found myself at war with the architect of the Guildford Cathedral, Sir something, I can't remember his name now, and it was just sort of in my blood, really, to try and say, well, why do we have to, blinking well, have to develop everything? Why can't we actually recycle and redo? There we are.
And I know, well, you were instrumental in the setting up or the early years of the Farnham Building Preservation Trust. And I think Stedman Blower won a couple of awards, didn't they, for Tanyard House and the new house. So this aesthetics of architecture is actually one of the big characteristics of Michael Blower, it seems to me.
Well, the real instigator of the Building Trust, and I can say this, that the Building Trust probably one of the most successful in this country, was Sir John Verney.
Yeah,
it was really quite a revelation when he told me that he'd been at the Architectural Association, my school I went to, and he'd been there when he came out of the forces, a decorated soldier, and he'd been. He said, unfortunately, I couldn't finish the course, Michael. I was married, and I was already nearly 30, and so I went into filmmaking. And another one, and this was the hallmark of this wonderful school, the Architectural Association, is, for example, Robert Donut was who 39 Steps was a student at the Architectural Association. He left it, so it was a very broad thing. But Sir John started the Building Preservation Trust, and of course, he then decided that he and his wife decided they'd go and live in Clare in Suffolk, and left me to sort of be the secretary. And I went from sort of being secretary and onwards, and there we go. Yeah, but
there you go.
You gave me a good turn, and I really enjoyed preservation and restoration.
Well, and I think many of us living here now have a lot to be grateful for you putting your hand up, Michael, for that. But let's talk a little bit about what you've referred to, which is the pressure of development, the need, as it's often expressed, for homes, but development versus the thing that we can't replace, which is losing heritage or losing notable buildings. And how do we reconcile that understandable pressure? I don't mean politically, but how do you see it? How do we manage to continue to provide and at the same time preserve?
I think it's a jolly good question, Richard. And it's, I think probably it's a matter of balance, but balancing the advantages with things like climate change and environment, and there's fundamental things. I think trying to find this balance, which we can't blame the government for this and that all the time. You've got to say, well, yes, we do need houses, and we do need this, but I just found it, for example, Woolmead, I think, is a classic example of what was awful, and that was to pull down some wonderful row of cottages, which if they're today, and I've seen photographs of them, they would be as good as anything we've got in Farnham. Mm. What have we got? Just a heap of rubble now, because I suppose that we will eventually get something there, but I don't really look forward to what we are going to get, because they're just going to pile in houses. But it's, yes, development is, I think it's sort of people have to develop, whereas do they really have to develop? Can't they just, make do with what they've got sometimes?
Repurpose, reuse?
Purpose, reuse, and really it is. One of our exhibitions was, as I've told you, in the Blow Family, the Farnham Society, actually, Heritage Weekend, was the reuse of old buildings. And one example that we had was of Krakow in Poland. We had a Polish architect here, And I asked him, I said, what did you do after the war when you, he said, well, Krakow was not so unfortunate. It was kept, but he said, and so he obtained from Krakow some photographs. And one of the things that absolutely amazed me is that the Schindler factory, which we all know about, has been preserved and is now a museum. Wow. So you see, it is possible to be just as creative and inventive by, you know, redoing something with what you've got already without pulling it all down.
But you're not arguing, at least I remember previous conversations, you're not arguing for that, you know, modern design should be a Disney version of what existed before. There is a role for our age, for excellence in our age with our design. I tell you what's in my mind. I went to a stately home up in Oxfordshire with the, I can't remember the family's name, but it was the set for Shakespeare in Love. They hire it out. And the family have been there for even longer than the Blowers in Shrewsbury, Michael. They go back to the 15th century at least. And I remember the Earl telling me there that every generation that inherits the stately home takes one room and redoes it in keeping with the current fashions. And so you walk along this corridor and you've got this series, because he says that's the signature we want to leave for our time. So there is a role for modern design and modern development. It's not all about, you know, timber frame buildings, etc., is it?
No, exactly. But what he did, I guess, when you were there, you noticed that they hadn't pulled down.
Absolutely.
That's
so they had repurposed.
Absolutely. I'm very interested in what you just said, and I think that's terrific. And that can be done and is being done. I mean, if you take, for example, St. James's Church in East Street, a wonderful church, ironstone, it's been converted to 17 units, and inside it's sheet, you know, glass partitions. It's very much in keeping the modern style. But the church, in essence, it's still there in its shape and form. So it can, you know, it's amalgamation, really.
I mean, obviously, there's a political dimension to this, and we're non-political. But I wonder whether this is what led you to stand as a councillor. I mean, you were 20 years a councillor for Surrey. You were a past mayor of Waverley. Was it this drive for appropriate development or other factors that led you to standing as a councillor and being one of our councillors for all that length of time?
Well, I have to say it was being a sucker, really.
Yeah. I couldn't possibly comment.
We had Brigadier and Zora Bransby Williams, who you may remember, but they were a wonderful couple, and they lived down at Willie Mill, and Morgan used to ring me up every blinking morning and say, Michael, you've got to stand. We're going to get in. And he's a well-known Liberal.
Michael, it's that Blower thing. Blower, you speak French, you go to Brussels.
Exactly. And then I said, look, Morgan, I cannot. I've got running a practice. I've got 6 kids. I've got a mortgage up. And he said, and then next morning he'd start again. And eventually, it's true, it really is true. Oh God, here he is again. I packed it in and I said, all right. He said, well, look, I promise you, that you won't have to attend any meetings after the first one. The first one, we will table a motion, so if we get in, to return all Farnham's property to Farnham. And that is the main thrust of what we should be doing, because we have got the biggest portfolio of property in Waverley, and they're snatching it, all the other parts of Waverley are taking it off us, and we want to get that portfolio back. So I went to the meeting. I was appointed there's a bit of a shortage, if you like, of whatever. And I've got appointed chairman of leisure and environment, and sort of hardly ever heard of before. And of course, my attendance for the first year was second only to the leader. And so there you are. That's why I was a sucker. And yeah, I mean, you get on and do it, don't you? You know, I was there. And, but I have to say that we never returned a bit of Farnham we never succeeded. And there we go.
And what were the issues of the time? You've talked about the return of property. I mean, that's still a subject now, but when you look back on that time as a councillor, what were the issues that were dominant at that stage? Was it development? Traffic?
I think it was, yeah, I mean, there had been, there was always that political tension between the two parties, the two major parties. And that was, I think, was rather unpleasant, because I had lots of, you know, I got on well with, you know, I had no problem with politics in that sense, but I think that there was a lot of bad things being done, and I don't know what it was. Waverley has never really been comfortable. There's always been a jealousy, I think, tension, envy, whatever it is, between Farnham and Godalming, and I think that took a lot of the energy out of what we were doing. Farnham is the biggest and the wealthiest, if you like, in terms of, you know, its ratage. Hazelmere always stood on its own, and Cranley was so far out. It really is, I don't think it's ever been a very sort of comfortable borough in that sense. I think it's sort of a bit awkward. I mean, it was always difficult to get to Godalming. You know, it's a cross-country sort of.
Did you enjoy being a councillor?
Yes, I did actually. I didn't sort of take it too seriously. And, you know, I did, because I made good friends there. You know, I got on with people and didn't sort of, yeah, I got on, you know, I was on the planning committees and various things, tried to do a bit. It's really all I was any good at. I mean, I don't think I was a very good councillor, actually, because
I'm sure
I don't know enough about it. That's the problem.
Well, look, we perhaps ought to think about coming towards the end. I think we could go on for a lot longer, but let's come back to Farnham, you know, with your more than, am I right in saying 50 years contribution in so many ways to what we would now describe as community. But how would you sell Farnham now to somebody thinking of coming to live here?
Well, I think I always remember I have asked people, I do ask people, why do you come here? And mostly because they want to live near their children or be part of that. But one person, and I've heard that several times, said we came from the, I think it was West Country, and we came past and down through Odium, through with a Farnham Park on the top there, and we came round down round the castle, and we just couldn't believe the sight when we looked down and saw this wonderful street ending in the bottom of the bank, NatWest Bank. We just couldn't believe that an English country town could be so appealing, and that's what did it. And I think there is that sort of thing. There is that. I know that's only one approach, but it is. I think it's a flat town, generally speaking. People, you know, Guildford is a very hilly town and difficult to maneuver. Also, I think that it has so many paths, footpaths and yards, which you can use without having to use the road. You can cross over. And then, of course, there's wonderful church lanes, and I love those, because it's that is unspoilt, and the churchyard and everything. It's a lovely, lovely building. area, and I love that part of Farnham.
We've talked about development, and obviously we see all around us the pressure and the new development going ahead. You've mentioned that's not new in the sense of Woolmead in the past, but are you optimistic about the future of Farnham and preserving it as this lovely old market town, or are you newly pessimistic about it?
No, I'm not pessimistic. No, I'm not, because I think we you know, human beings, they adapt. We will have made some mistakes, but I think we're going to also see that there'll be some good things coming out of this. I mean, it's a big development. I haven't been inside what's happening at Brightwells, and parts of it could be really good. And I mean, I think, you know, I'm not, I can't say optimistic, but I'm not certainly, you know, this is how, you know, history moves on. It's history builds the towns.
And in all your time, whether, you know, it's as Stedman Blower architects and award-winning architects, whether it's conservation, whether it's writing, you know, what was the name of it? Environmental Viewpoint back in the 90s. As you look back across that, what are you most proud of?
Well, I remember, if I could just slightly change the tone of that, I remember at school, I only started playing cricket at the age of 14 because of being in Belgium that time. And I really loved cricket and took to it and used to play in the nets a lot. And I was very, very proud to get into the first team in my last summer. And we had a Nottinghamshire coach called Shipston, and Shippy, as we called him, would say to us as we went out to bat, "Stay put, lad, Runzel cum." And I've been in Farnham, as you say, 50, 60, well, known him for 80 years, but 60 years, 50 years. I got wonderful, you know, it's a wonderful town to be in, got a good family, a good home. Runzeld cum, and they have cum. That's what I'm proud of.
Michael, I think that's a lovely way to finish, and I'm sure many of us would like to say thank you to you in all that you've done and for what you've done for Farnham. And thank you for joining me this morning in conversation. We have, I think, a second episode of this to come. But for now, Michael Blower, MBE, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Richard. And I have to say that you've been a great pleasure actually listening to your questions and talking to them. You've done it exactly as you said you would. It's as if we were in the same room and smiling and a bit of larking about. That's well done, and thank you.
I am actually 6'7" tall, but you won't know that. But thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Bye-bye.